Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome. So, buying property in Portugal can be one of the best investments you ever make, or one of the most expensive mistakes if you don't know what to look for. And today, we will provide you with legal, financial, and practical considerations that can protect your investment and ensure you are on the safe side. So, whether you are planning to relocate to Portugal, invest in real estate, purchase a holiday home, or simply explore your options, you are in the right place. Knowing how to navigate the process correctly can save you considerable time, money, and stress. So, today we will take you through the entire property acquisition journey in Portugal, from identifying the right property for you and conducting legal due diligence to understanding taxes, financing options, contracts, and some of the most common mistakes that buyers make here. So, a quick reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel before we begin, and we will share the link in the chat. So make sure to subscribe and stay up to date with our latest content on moving to Portugal, investing here, citizenship, and property matters. And as always, the first 20 participants who contact us using the code SGP or partner to moving to Portugal, we will be offering a free initial consultation with our team. So, for those joining us for the first time, my name is Marisa Colasso, and I'm part of the team at SGP Sandra Gomes Pinto and Associates. Over the years, we've had the privilege of assisting hundreds of families, investors, retirees, property buyers from around the world in making Portugal their new home. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sandra. She has spent more than 30 years helping international clients navigate complex legal matters in Portugal. Throughout her career, she has advised investors, property purchasers, developers, families, and individuals relocating to Portugal from every corner of the world. She has seen firsthand the opportunities that Portugal offers, but also the costly mistakes that can arise when buyers do not receive the right guidance. So, Dr. Sandra, to begin, could you briefly introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your firm, and give us a brief overview of how you help someone who's interested in purchasing property in Portugal?
So my name is Sandra Gomes Pinto. I'm a lawyer in Portugal for over 30 years. I worked always with international clients in litigation, in interesting and big projects such as the enlargement of the bridge 25 de Abril as a lawyer from the leader of the consortium, also the renovation of the German school, also as a lawyer. This was a project partially funded by the German government. I always worked with visas, litigation, arbitration, international clients, a lot of German clients. I've been speaking about investment in Portugal, tax advantages, visas, litigation, and arbitration, a little bit all over the world. In the last 10 years, I have my own firm. We have assisted over 500 investors, families, Americans, British, Canadians relocating to Portugal. We know very well these markets. We know exactly how to help them. And our objective is that people are fully supported and we are committed of being of service and knowing very well what we are doing and helping as much as we can our clients so they can do safe deals and they can navigate the still chaotic Portuguese bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm. So, to dive right into this process that you mentioned, to start with the buying process and the due diligence. So, can you tell us, Dr. Sandra, what is the step-by-step process for buying a property in Portugal from securing a NIF and maybe a local bank account to finally signing the deed?
So, first of all, I would like to urge you to put your questions, even if we do not come immediately back to you. We'll try to cover your questions and your particular issues. The first step in Portugal would be also to get a NIF. In Portugal, to do anything, also when kids are born, I think getting a NIF is one of the most important and first things you have to do to enter into any type of deal. So to get an NIF, which is for the Americans something equivalent such as your social security number, although is not as secret as your social security number. And this is something we can do online for you. We try to be a one-stop shop in terms of the legal process of buying a property. So from getting an IF to a bank account, the second step would be to open a bank account. Typically, although not absolutely mandatory when you're buying property in Portugal, it is highly advisable also to in terms of transparency, to comply with the Anti-Money Laundering Act, and also because the owner of the property, the seller, expect to have a bank check from the buyer by the time you have the deed. So typically this is a very important to have the bank account, and you'll need later to pay the fees, to pay the utilities, to pay the taxes, to pay the condominium, and many times you pay through the so-called multi-bank or the ATM machines in Portugal. So having a bank account here can simplify enormously your life. So I think the first two steps in this process of opening the bank account would be to get an IF, to get a bank account, and then to find the property that you're looking for according to your criteria. You can look online with Idealist, and then you can ask your lawyer to contact them. You can get a realtor, and once you find your property, you can eventually, if you consider this a good option, take it out of the market and get a reservation, paying something like 5,000 to 10,000 euros to take the house outside of the market, while your lawyer can do a legal due diligence in respect to this house, checking if all the documentation is in order, if there are litigation in respect to this house, if there are mortgages, if there are liens, and also they can check before the city council if the license is okay. And you can, even in many cases for used houses, it makes sense to have a technical due diligence on the house. And if you're buying something that is not yet built, it might make sense to check the license and to do also a financial due diligence on the developer, because although you make the best deals before things are built, additional legal cares and cautions and measures should be taken to prevent any problem, because the risk is greater when you are buying something that is not yet built. Once your lawyer did the legal due diligence, you had the technical due diligence, eventually you had an independent appraisal of the house, so you're sure the value you're paying it's a decent one, then you can move forward to the promissory contract. Then the promissory contract, unlike the reservation, which is a sort of an agreement, a gentleman's agreement, the promissory contract is a binding contract. And with the promissory contract, you put the details of the buyer, the details of the seller, the details of the property you are acquiring, and all the details of the deal, the date of completion, where the deed should be made, who will schedule the deed, if conflict arises, how these conflicts be solved, the declarations that the seller makes, saying that the house had the apartment or the property has no pollutant materials, that there are no hidden defects, that everything is properly licensed, and all these details are very, very important for you to verify before when you enter into a contract like this. Then after you sign the promissory contract, and with this promissory contract, the signatures of both parties should be notarized, so we have a fully formal contract. And we do highly advise people to register in the land registry a provisional register of this contract, and this can be enormously powerful and can protect enormously the buyer, because it prevents the seller to sell to a third party, and it prevents a creditor of the seller to register more liens then would also be enforceable to someone buying a house. So registering a promissory contract can be the best protection a buyer has when they enter into a promissory contract and they pay a certain down payment to the seller. Because in Portugal, the down payment or the deposit is not typically put into an escrow account, but is given directly to the seller. And so, for the buyer to be protected, it makes all the sense that the promissory contract is registered. This is a great protection, again, for the buyer when you are acquiring a house. After the promissory contract, the next step is the deed that can be done by a lawyer or a notary. And here there is a double check of all the legality of all the documentation of the houses. And this is where there is this transaction of property. So the property passes from the seller to the buyer. And immediately after the deed, there is the registry where, again, there is a verification of all the legality of the documents. The registry is done immediately after the deed or the DPA, and you should ask always a proof that a register was made, because immediately the house will be, at least in a provisional way, registered in your name before the land register. It's very important to know that in Portugal we have a land register, so with a code you can access to a sort of the ID of a property. You can know who are the owners, who are the previous owners, if there is litigation, liens, mortgages, tenants in respect to this household. That's a lot of information that you can acquire from a house just with a code, with the land register certificate. So in many situations, you're not required to have a title insurance as you have many times in the US, because you have this land register, and plus the additional legal due diligence that your lawyer does to the house can be extremely safe to buy, and extremely straightforward and safe if you have the proper professional assisting you. Immediately after the deed and the register, typically this should be automatic, but you should verify if the house was registered before the tax authority, because although this should be automatic, sometimes this is not made immediately.
And I think this is a good overview of the process. And coming to right in the beginning, when you mentioned that it would facilitate the process to have a Portuguese bank account. So you would say it's not mandatory, but it makes it easier.
I think it's highly advisable, and it may create a lot of problems if you don't have a Portuguese bank account. Typically, the buyer expects you to pay with a bank check in his name at a time. And this is much easier to obtain if you do it through your own account, and also in terms of transparency. So in terms of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, it is a better option to have you directly paying your own house with a Portuguese bank check from a Portuguese bank than to having your lawyer doing that. I think in terms of simplicity, transparency, directness, this is the best option. And many times you also be needing the bank account later to pay the taxes, to pay the utilities, to pay the condominium fees, to pay things you have to pay typically through a Portuguese ATM.
And I think this also answers one of the questions we have in our chat from Wendy Sean Wetter. My bank wouldn't let me take more than 2,000 per day out of the ATM to go directly for a car. I had to go to the bank and pay a fee for them to create a bank check. Is that how it would be for the house too?
Yes, for the house it would be for a bank check. But just imagine, if you have to do a bank transfer for the down payment, you can ask previously your bank for an authorization to do this type of transparency. So eventually you can pay the down payment through a transference, and I have done so when I acquired recently an office. But I asked my bank previously for an authorization, and they were expecting me to do this transference, and they asked me to do an additional call just to confirm that it was me and they will be doing this transference. So there are several options. You just need to talk with your bank and the person professional assisting you, and they of course will find out the best solutions for you at a specific case.
And now coming to the due diligence that you mentioned, doing before the property purchase, what mandatory legal checks and due diligence must be done before making an offer to avoid inheriting a previous owner's debts?
So it would be important to check, as I said previously, the land registry certificate, the certificate permanent. You can check whether there is litigations, where there are mortgages, where there are liens. And in the promissory contract, it should also be clear that you are buying free of all this stuff, that you are buying free of mortgages, liens, and so litigation. So many times some of these debts are paid just immediately before the deed, so you buy free of liens, mortgages, or any type of encumbrances. So the land registry is very important. It was also important that you check, there's a check before the tax authority. It will be also important that the condominium, when there's a condominium exists, that they issue a declaration that the previous owner, the seller, has no debts before the condominium. These are the most important measures to avoid debts.
And through these measures, is it also possible to spot illegal extensions, unpermitted construction, or any
Yes,
other?
you have to see, and your the technical person you hire for this purpose, or you can put your lawyer to take care of this with a whole team. They should verify if the layout of the existing property corresponds to what is in the city council, that was licensed in the city council before the city council. So you can see if there's any illegal extensions, if there is discrepancy between what was licensed and what really exists in this property.
So can you also explain the process of verifying that a property is fully licensed and has a valid use license and energy certificate?
So your lawyer and your technical person should verify before the city council if what actually exists was properly licensed. And it was important also to check the license of usage. Just for as an example, the office we bought cannot be used as a residency. It has only license of usage for an office. So it would be important to check the license of usage to see if that property can be used for the usage you intend to do. It's important to know that before the things built before 1951 and that had no big structural changes are exempted from license of usage, but also in these cases, you need a declaration of exemption of license of usage. And then also to be important in terms of verifying the energy efficiency of a house, and this is according to the EU plan to make EU in general more energy efficient, that you have to check the energy efficient certificate, which is mandatory also for a deed, and you'll see how efficient from A to F, how efficient, A being the most efficient, F the least efficient. You see how efficient a real estate piece is.
And would you also advise people to hire an independent senior engineer to inspect the property for maybe hidden structural or roof defects before signing a contract?
Definitely, especially if you are buying something used and being within the American market, people are very aware and careful about molds, about buying things that have no pollutant materials. There was a time in the 80s where in Portugal asbestos was used. We had some clients that bought a property that had asbestos in its construction, and it was important to remove, and it was not clear that it was the seller's fault. So this is very important to clarify very well in the promissory contract, and it's very important even before enter into a promissory contract that is properly checked whether there is mold, there are hidden defects, there are pollutant materials being used, there is damp, that there are electric problems. These should be analyzed even if it's not in a super deep way. A technical due diligence is fundamental when you are doing this kind of investment.
Mm-hmm. And in another scenario, what happens if the property has existing tenants or an informal lease agreement? How does this complicate the sale?
So it's very important to bear in mind that tenants in Portugal are highly protected. If you have tenants, typically the lease contract will be enforced upon you when you buy a house. But it's very important that you know exactly what are you entering into, and this should be perfectly clarified in the promissory contract. It's important to know also that a tenant has the right of preference when someone is selling a house. So if you have a tenant and you are selling a house to a third party, you first have to offer the tenant with some conditions you are doing to the third party to see, and he has a preference if you like to acquire this property. And this is quite important, because then if you don't comply with it, the tenant can declare annul the transaction you did.
Mm-hmm. And how does the provisional registration of the acquisition at the land registry protect the investment made from third-party claims?
Just imagine you want to buy a property. The cost of the property is 500,000 euros. You pay a down payment of 50,000, which you give to the seller. It's quite important that you go to the land register or someone on your behalf, or and register the promissory contract, because that prevents the seller that has already the money in his pocket to sell to a third party, and also prevents an eventual creditor of the seller to register a lien that can be enforced upon you. So it's quite important. I think it's the basic protection of someone giving money to a seller, a down payment or a deposit to a seller. They should protect themselves, and I think the provisional register of the promissory contract is a basic protection.
Mm-hmm. And I was just looking at our chat, and I will take a few questions before we move on to some of the other questions. Some questions from Don Khan. Should a land survey be done as well if land is part of the purchase?
Yes, I think this could be a possibility. Depends on the usage you want to give to this property, but this could also be done.
Mm-hmm. He has also asked if we are able to provide a checklist for considering a purchase in Portugal.
Of course, we can do that.
And another question from Wendy. Are there any protections for tenants that are over 65 or 70 where they cannot be removed? I think
yes, there's additional provision. In general, the Portuguese law is very protective of the tenants, and the judges are even more protective. So typically, and people above these ages are highly protected always.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And now moving on to our questions on the contract itself, the promissory contract. Can you explain, Dr. Sandra, what exactly is a promissory contract and what does it mean for deposit and legal rights in that contract?
The promissory contract, first of all, is a binding contract, is a contract that is already highly regulated by default in our civil code, and there's a huge tradition of promissory contracts. Although it's not mandatory when you acquire a property to have a promissory contract, I highly advise you to do so. And in most cases, there is always a promissory contract. And in this promissory contract, you define who is the buyer, you identify the seller, you identify the property, and the seller commits himself to oblige himself to sell, and the buyer oblige himself to buy the property. If the seller does not comply with the contract, he may be obliged to pay the down payment or the deposit in double, or he may be forced to do an execução específica, meaning the buyer can ask the court to issue a declaration for the deed to transfer the property to his name. If the buyer does not comply with the contract, and typically if he doesn't show up in the date of the deed, everything was properly done, and typically there should be always an option of a first prorogation. If he doesn't show the second time, then he may lose fully the money he paid as down payment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is basically, but you can also always regulate otherwise if you want to do a different deal. This is the standard, the traditional way, but if anything is not forbidden in the law, you can always regulate the deal exactly as you want.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, if the sale falls through due to a fault of the seller, it is possible to get back the down payment.
Yes, it is possible, but in that case, you would be in a much better position if you have the promissory contract registered. If the seller does not comply, you can be reimbursed of the down payment, and you should receive typically the down payment in double.
And also, I think this covers some of the other questions, but what are the risks of paying the 10% down payment directly to the seller? And how does the promissory contract protect those funds, as you've mentioned? Yes.
Typically in Portugal, the payment is done directly to the seller. It doesn't go to an extra account. This is typically what normally happens. And in this case, you are more protected, and you are protected when the promissory contract is registered, which we highly recommend. And we also highly recommend that the signatures of the parties in the promissory contract are duly notarized, because then you have really a formal and a binding contract.
And to talk about bank loans, is it possible to include a financing contingency clause in the promissory contract? If in case the buyer is not able to secure a bank loan?
Yes, this is perfectly possible. So you can insert a clause in the contract saying, if I'm not able to obtain a loan within this time, then the contract will be void, or it will not be in vigor, and I will have the possibility to get my money back. But I normally advise my clients to do the other way around. So first, before they enter into a promissory contract, they should check if they are in the conditions to finance themselves fully for this contract. So first, if you have this opportunity, first try to see if you can secure a loan and a mortgage, and only after that you should enter into a promissory contract. If this is possible, this is typically the advice I give to my clients. First, secure your financing and make sure your financing is approved, and only enter into a contract later. And I have prevented a lot of very important complications to our clients with this advice.
And we have, I'll just take a question from the chat from Terry Farrow. Are there any other contingencies that are typically added besides the financing contingency, such as inspection contingency?
Then again, I would also add and advise people to do that before they enter into the promissory contract. So inspect the house before you enter into the contract, in the promissory contract. Eventually, within the reservation period where you take the house out of the market and you put 5,000 euro just as in the escrow account, just to take the property out of the market. And while you're doing that, you can have the house inspected, and you should only enter into the promissory contract afterwards. But you can also, it depends on what you want and what's your interest and how you can best defend your will at a certain situation, because you may want to proceed and secure that house, but put an additional clause saying that if you find pollutant materials or if you find hidden defects, then the seller will have to compensate for what you find or will have to repair that. It will depend on what you want, and for that case we can prepare and make a tailor-made contract for your specific wishes, for your specific deal, and for the best way to defend your interests at a specific situation.
Mm-hmm. And for those buying property with an unmarried partner, how is this deal structured? Is it overly complicated in the deed? And
I think it's similar for any situation of co-ownership. It should be clear which percentage each of the parties has. Typically, I would advise them to have a private agreement where they would define what would happen if they separate, how would they like to solve the situation, or if they intend to sell. I think it would be important to have a private agreement where that people should deal, if any, and deal in a preventive way any problems that might arise.
Mm-hmm. And now coming to another important consideration for people interested in buying, the taxes, fees, and other closing costs. How much would one pay in property transfer tax and stamp duty in Portugal?
So stamp duty is 0.8%. Property taxes has different brackets from 60% to 80%. Then on top of these, you can have legal fees, you can have the cost of the deed, the registered cost. I think if you put 10% on top of the price of the property, you are on a safe side. So you put the price of the property and you add to that amount 10%, and that should give you a value that's where you are more or less safe in terms of the whole costs of buying a property.
Mm-hmm. So you would say this 10% would include the IMT tax, stamp duty, notary fees?
Yes.
Okay.
Register fees, lawyers' fees, everything.
Okay. And how can one qualify? How can one qualify for the IMT and stamp duty exemption for first-time buyers who are under 35 purchasing their primary residence in Portugal? Is this something?
Yes, this is something people can do if they are under 35. It's if it's their first property. If the property is less than 330,000 and something euros, then can have a full exemption. Then from 660,000 and something till 330,000 euros and something, there is a partial exemption. You can check the brackets, but if you are under 35, if you're buying something that is below 6,000 and 606,000 euros something, you can benefit from a partial or a total exemption. You just have to consult the brackets and the exact amounts.
And just a question from one of our viewers, Wendy Seanwater. She asked if it was 60 to 80%, but I think it was 6 to 8. So I think there was
in terms of the
property transfer
tax is 6% to 80%, 8%, 6 to 8%. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And yes. So when and how do people actually pay these taxes and notary fees? Can they be paid on the day of the deed? And how is it paid? With a credit card?
Yes, typically on the day of the deeds and through bank transfers or with debit card or even in an ATM machine near the notary or the lawyer's office, this is possible, or a home banking.
Okay.
Typically, we advise people to do it at the day of the deed because sometimes the deed is not made because there's a little document or there's a detail missing. And so we typically advise that these taxes should be paid where you are 100% sure that the deed will be made.
Mhm. And before I proceed to the next question, I'll just take another question from the chat from Victoria David. For a renovation listing stating it has an approved project, how does evaluation process work? And what is included in the listed price?
I don't understand. I fully understand Victoria's question. Can you repeat if you or paraphrase it, please,
Yes.
Marisa?
So for a renovation listing stating that it has approved, the project is approved,
Yes.
how would this be evaluated?
How is it? What do you mean? If this is evaluating the value of the property, or I didn't
Yes,
fully
I
understand.
think it requires a bit of clarification. So maybe for this specific situation, you could send an email and we would get back to you because the evaluation would depend on what you are asking about.
If you want to buy something that is not yet licensed, you should be, and you should be sure, and you should ask the city council to be sure that the city council issues a decision and information that they will approve this license.
Okay. And now coming to purchasing a property within an urban rehabilitation area. Is this automatically tax exempted, and is there a separate approval process?
Now, there's a separate approval process. So don't take it for granted and don't take it as automatic, as in general in Portugal when there is a bureaucratic process at stake.
And what are the tax implications in Portugal for capital gains if I sell a US property to fund a Portuguese home before versus after becoming a Portuguese tax resident?
If you do it before you become a Portuguese tax resident, sell a house in the US, and before you become a tax resident, and in the year before you do it, Portugal has nothing to do with it. If you sell US home after becoming Portuguese tax resident, according to the current budget, it is possible that these capital gains are deducted if you acquire a home in Portugal. This is a possibility, but you have to check if you fulfill the requirements.
And a question from one of our viewers, Terry. How much did you say is paid to the real estate agent? We have not mentioned, and the commission paid by the seller.
So, to the real estate agent, only a commission is due if you have a real estate contract with real estate agent. If you don't have a written contract, no commission is due. And the commission you are paying depends on what you establish in the written contact with the realtor. So it is typically between 3 to 5%, but it depends on what is written specifically in the contract, which is mandatory. And without this written contract, no commission is due. So it depends on what you establish with the realtor. And you should have a written contract where this is black and white. You should also verify if the realtor is duly licensed. Otherwise, if he's not licensed, the contract is also void.
Okay. And coming to mortgages and financing, what documents do Portuguese banks require to approve a mortgage?
So typically the identification documents of the parties, so your NIF, your passport, then they want to know your income information. So your last 3 tax returns, typically your last pay stubs. They would like to see your financial records, your bank statements, your last bank statements, and they would like to understand your overall patrimony and the overall debts you have. I think all these would be the relevant elements that the banks would be asking to check if you could be eligible for a mortgage or not.
And how does age affect the maturity limits and term length of a mortgage in Portugal?
So typically, the Portuguese banks between 70 and 72 only loan money to people until they are 70, 72, which is a surprise for a lot of Americans, but this is typically the Portuguese rule.
And can the bank's property appraisal come in lower than the purchase price? And how does that affect the required down payment?
So typically, if you're not resident in Portugal, the bank can only loan you 70 to 80% of the value of the property. If you're resident, it would be 80 to 90%, but of the value of the appraisal. So if the appraisal says the property is less than the transactional value, you can only get a loan, depend on the situation, of 70 or 80% of the price of evaluation. So you are limited. You can, if the evaluation is less than the transactional value of the property, your loan will be limited.
And when it comes to transferring funds internationally, how long would you say it typically takes, and when must the money be available in the Portuguese account for the?
It depends, and sometimes there are problems with transfers. So I would say 5 to 7 working days, but I would be very cautious. I would eventually add a contingency clause and would advise people to make sure they have the money 10 days or 1 week before they really need it, just to not to enter into any risks of to be not comply with the contract, and may have the risk to lose a down payment.
And on the final, for the final payment handled on the day of the deed, the bank, as you said, issues a guaranteed check directly to the seller.
Yes, a bank check direct in the name of the seller.
Okay. And now to take just the other question from the chat from Wendy Seanwetter. Is it typical to have a real estate agent who charges a fee to help you find a house? Should I engage someone like that, or is the commission enough when a house is purchased?
No, it depends. You can find in the Idealista and the other sites if it's okay for you. If you find if you want a more professional or personalized help, you may engage with a real estate person.
And of course, if our viewers have any other concerns or questions, I urge you to contact us, send us an email, and we have already put our contact details in the chat so you can reach out to us. And Dr. Sandra, I would like to ask you now for final advice for those who are interested in purchasing property in Portugal. What would you
I
tell them?
think it's if you want your interest to be defended by someone independent, I think it's very important to have an independent lawyer and independent from the real estate agent. And the real estate market, the agents and the business, I think is one of the most competitive and aggressive business. And they will make everything to have their lawyers, their staff looking at your things, but they would basically look after their interests. So if you want someone independent, you should have your own lawyer. You should also fulfill the legalities. So it's important to have a legal due diligence of the documentation. It's important to have a technical due diligence. It's important someone checking the license. It's important to have someone technical checking the mold, the hidden defects, the pollutant materials. we've had problems with, and it's very important also to register the promissory contract, because I think this is one of the it's the way you are protected when you handle money to a seller as a down payment.
Mhm. And for any other unanswered questions that you might have, please contact us, and we have left our details in the chat. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel where we regularly post updates. And another thing we would also like is suggestions for topics that you would like us to cover. So thank you for joining us today and spending time here with us. And we will wait to hear from you all. And yes, thank you for your time. And Dr. Sandra, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic.
Thank you, Marisa, for doing this with us. And thank you all for attending me. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out. It will be our pleasure to address your specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.